From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hannah Zubairi. Our top story tonight is about rising Islamophobia in North America. For the first time, the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, has released a report highlighting incidents of Islamophobia in North America. CAIR normally reports on anti-Muslim incidents in the US only. But this year was an exception. This was because of recent serious Islamophobic incidents in Canada. The CAIR report highlights spike in anti-Muslim crimes and bias. The report details only 38 of the worst incidents out of the hundreds reported so far in 2021. These include hate crimes, harassment, school bullying, discrimination, and hate speech. It also documents the June 6 attack on the Afzal family. In that incident, a white supremacist killed 4 out of 5 family members. He rammed his truck into them as they waited at an intersection in London, Ontario. CAIR's report noted 11 more violent crimes against Canadian Muslims since then. The document offers recommendations to reverse the trend of increased Islamophobia. These include a call for US President Joe Biden to condemn incidents when they occur. It also suggests aggressive federal prosecution of crimes when local law enforcement fails to act. The United States will continue airstrikes in support of Afghan troops. US General Frank McKenzie made a surprise visit to Afghanistan recently. He's the head of the US Central Command in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Here he's talking to reporters after his meeting with Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani.
President Biden has set a date of 31 August for the cessation of our campaign here. After that date, we will still provide significant logistics support to the Afghan military. We will still provide significant logistics support, in particular to the Afghan Air Force, through maintenance here on the ground, as well as maintenance at advanced bases in the Central Command Theater. So all of those things will continue. So we will continue to support the Afghan forces even after that 31 August date. It will generally be from over the horizon.
In related news, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan said Turkey plans talks with the Taliban over the Kabul airport. In response, a Taliban spokesperson said that the country should send engineers, not troops, to Afghanistan. Zabiullah Mujahid says Turkey should help rebuild and unite Afghanistan. This is after 4 decades of war. Mujahid said Turkey should pull its armed forces out of the nation. Turkey has over 500 troops in Afghanistan as part of a non-combat mission. Diplomatic activity in and around Afghanistan is in high gear. The Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held a meeting with Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi in China on Saturday. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit India on July 28. There he will meet with Indian External Affairs Minister Subramanian Jaishankar. Pressure is growing to rein in Israeli spyware program Pegasus. This was after last week's revelation from watchdog group the Pegasus Project. Their investigation found that the Israeli software program was targeting dissidents. German Chancellor Angela Merkel is urging tighter international controls on the trade of spyware. French President Emmanuel Macron called an urgent national security meeting for Thursday to discuss the use of spyware in France. One of Macron's phone numbers was on a leaked list of potential Pegasus targets. A member of the Indian Parliament has also called for the country's Supreme Court to conduct an independent investigation. Pegasus targeted 300 Indian politicians, journalists, and Muslim activists. All were critical of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's fascist government. The Pegasus Project is an international investigative journalism effort to reveal spying abuses by various governments. Pegasus was developed by the Israeli NSO Group. France's right-wing Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin has fired 2 imams in France. This was on the grounds that their sermons were contrary to the values of the Republic. Imam Imadi Hamada is the resident scholar of the Grand Mosque of Saint-Chamond. He was fired for his sermon in which the Imam cited a hadith and verses from a chapter of the Quran. These related to the wives of Prophet Muhammad. The governor's office dismissed Imam Hamada and will not renew his residence permit at the minister's order. He said that he found the statements unacceptable and sees them against gender equality. The Hauts-de-Seine governorate also dismissed Imam Mahdi. Imam Mahdi had criticized the dress of some Muslim women in a June sermon in the Gennevilliers Mosque. The Interior Minister further asked the governor to intervene and suspend the mosque activities if a similar sermon is repeated. The minister is using new tools allowed by law to strengthen respect for the principles of the Republic. French lawyer Stéphane Guez is a human rights advocate. He criticized Darmanin for targeting imams. French media expert Sylvain Theroux accused the Interior Minister of hatred towards Islam. 16-year-old Jamal Hijazi has won a 2-year-long court battle against an anti-Muslim activist. Tommy Robinson is the founder of the far-right English Defense League. The BBC reports that he will pay Hijazi over $137,000 in libel damages. Roberts will also pay an additional $686,507 in legal expenses. These could bankrupt the far-right extremists. Hijazi was viciously attacked at school by fellow students in October 2018. He was pushed to the ground and water was poured on his face as if he was being waterboarded. A video of the attack went viral. In a series of Facebook posts about the attack, Robinson said Hijazi was not an innocent victim. He claimed that Hijazi attacked girls of English descent at his school and stabbed a boy. All allegations were false. As a result of Robinson's post, Hijazi and his family became a target for abuse. His family left their home and Hijazi had to abandon his education. In his verdict, the judge noted Robinson made a deliberate effort to portray Hijazi as a violent aggressor. China has expressed strong support for Pakistan in its dispute over Kashmir with India. Control of the region has been central to Pakistan's conflict with India for the last 70 years. It also said the dispute between the two countries should be resolved peacefully. The Chinese government said that this should be through the United Nations Charter, relevant Security Council resolutions, and bilateral agreements. China also said that it opposes any unilateral actions that complicate the situation in Kashmir. Water is being stolen from the parched communities of California as a statewide drought deepens. Water thieves are drilling into water supply lines, breaking into water stations, and stealing from fire hydrants. They're also threatening violence against farmers as they steal their water. Northern California is hit the hardest, and water theft there is significantly impacting the community. Thieves are using the stolen water for their marijuana crops, which require more water than other crops. In Southern California, thieves use water trucks to steal water from fire hydrants and water mains. This causes the pressure to fall low and the supply system to fail. A Hindutva father of 9 is blaming Muslims for India's massive population. Ram Lallu Vashya joined several other lawmakers in calling for a 2-child policy targeting Indian Muslims. Vashya himself has 9 children. This is 3 times the number of children an average Indian Muslim family has. The Hindutva ideology of the ruling party in India consistently claims that the country's Muslims are a population time bomb. In the past, millions of Indians consisting of mostly Muslims and other poor people have been rounded up and forcibly sterilized. From the bitterness of Guantanamo to the sweetness of the plains of Iroquois. Ahmed Ahjam, a man of struggle and perseverance. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saliha Farouk.
Ahmed Ajam spent almost 13 years in Guantanamo Bay prison. He was never charged with any crime. Ahmed was never tried for any crime. He was 25 years old when he was captured and sent to Guantanamo. Finally, in 2014, at the age of 37, he was released in Uruguay. Uruguay took in 6 Guantanamo prisoners in exchange for economic aid. Ahmed is originally from Syria, where he could not go back. Instead of living the nightmare of Guantanamo forever, Ahmed decided to turn his life around with sweets. Ahmed found success using his sister's recipes to make pastries, so he created a small store called Gastronomy Arab. Uruguayan cuisine is a fusion of cuisines including a few dishes that were introduced to Spain by the Arabs. But Ahmed's focus on Arab sweets is adding to the Uruguayan food landscape. His stand has small chalkboards advertising some of his wares: baklava, coffee, juice, the sesame paste tahini, or Uruguayan-style candy.
Muchísimas gracias.
Ahmed was one of the roughly 780 people sent to Guantanamo prison since 2002. There are still 39 people in the Guantanamo prison.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Tunisian president sacked the Prime Minister Hisham Mashishi and suspended parliament after a day of anti-government protests. Let's go to Saliha Farouk for a detailed analysis on the situation. Over to you, Saliha.
Thank you once again. Today we're very happy to be joined by Sami Hamdi, who is a managing director of the International Interest, which is a global risk and intelligence company. Sami, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, as you know, Tunisia was the country that brought the Arab Spring back in 2011, and it is regarded as a success story in that regard. How is the current revolt any different from that uprising back in 2011?
I think there are stark differences, first and foremost, in that 2011 was a revolt against a long-time dictator, authoritarian regime, autocratic rule. It was a regime that people used to call, it used to say the regime of Ras Taht al-Zara, which means the head under the blankets, and that don't talk, always keep your head down and be aware that any slight movement left or right against the government would land you in prison. I think the current situation is a bit different in that regard. However, I do think that the current protests that are taking place, it is not the protest in and of itself that is suddenly posing the issue with regards to Tunisia, but rather the reaction of the president, who has decided to suspend the constitution to activate what's called Article 80, in which he assumes the executive authority for himself. And not only that, he has lifted the diplomatic immunity, judicial immunity from the members of parliament, which means now he is able to sweep up his opponents, if he wishes, those members of parliament who have antagonized his bid to try to control the country. And for those who don't quite understand what that means, Tunisia is a country in which the constitution makes the parliament supreme and not the president. Executive authority is with the parliament, not with the president, and the president is now trying to seize that executive authority by suspending parliament and by activating this Article 80. The people in parallel are protesting as a result of a different situation, which is that there is an economic deprivation, which is nothing has improved since 2011. If not, it's got worse. We see water that's cut off a number of provinces. We've seen a number of different, we've seen unemployment soar. We've seen essentially a lack of genuine interest on the part of the government to solve these issues, as the political parties bicker over who should be the one who rules, who should be in charge of the government, who should be the one who essentially goes down in history as the one who leads Tunisia. So that political bickering, compounded by the economic crisis, compounded by poverty, compounded by this polarization that's taken place by the media, in which the media states that all of them are corrupt and nobody deserves to rule the country, and fueling that public opinion. All of these are culminating into this sort of spilling over of tensions that the president has now taken full advantage of to seize power for himself.
Thank you so much for that insight. You do bring us to our next question, which is that the prime minister has been dismissed in the country, as well as the Tunisian parliament was recently suspended after these anti-government protests. Is the Tunisian government here staging a coup, and what impact will this bring onto Tunisians?
It's the president who's staging a coup, not necessarily the government. The government is a government that is supported by the parliament, and that's what irks the president. The president, when he won the elections, when he won his landslide elections, when he came to power, he tried to rule the country directly and tried essentially to subvert the constitution and essentially rule himself, as opposed to using the parliament or allowing the parliament to decide the government. So he appointed the first prime minister and raised this stick of early elections on the parliament. Parliament didn't want to go to early elections. The president essentially said, either you agree on my prime minister or I force a constitutional clause that makes me go to early elections. And given the divided nature of parliament, the reality is they couldn't agree too easily. And when the threat was looming, when they had 1 day left to form a government, they decided to cede and go with the president's choice. Later, they would bring down that prime minister on corruption charges, and Nahda in particular would move against the prime minister on corruption charges. The president would appoint a new prime minister, expecting the prime minister to act as a proxy, but Nahda would convince this prime minister to betray the president and remove the president's loyalists from government. And that's what made the president especially angry. So much so that he announced he would no longer sign laws signed by the parliament, which was required of him in the constitution. And as a result, there was this sort of stalemate. The people got especially angry at the parliament in particular, which they believe is the party that is responsible for the strife. And so the president had decided to launch a coup with popular support, also with the support of France, with the support of the UAE, with support of Saudi Arabia, to essentially state that this parliament that the people now dislike, that the people blame for their woes, is what's causing the crisis. And now the president is launching a coup, and the coup in the meaning of which he is seizing all power for himself. He is seizing not only the executive power, but also the judicial power by assuming the responsibilities of the prosecutor general, which means he's now able to go after MPs, to put them in front of the courts, to put up trumped up charges against them, whether they might accuse them of the assassination of some MPs in 2013 or accuse them of corruption. Now the president is the one in charge of that portfolio. That means now he can purge his opponents if he wants. And the scale of the coup is such that even the parties that were supporting him over the past 8 months, who are calling on him to do a coup, who are calling on him to activate Article 80, are today turning around and saying, whoa, 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 maybe this isn't how we wanted it to pan out, because now these parties are realizing that they are not the primary beneficiaries, and there are frightening comparisons between what's taking place in Tunisia and what took place in Egypt in 2013, in which the army didn't just come in and do a coup. The army waited until there were people on the streets protesting against the government, coming down in Maidan al-Tahrir, and he got all the civil society on board, he got political parties on board, and then Sisi did his coup. And people are seeing something very similar take place in Tunisia.
Now, the Tunisian government has recently announced cuts to food and fuel subsidies. You talked a little bit about this, but if we could delve in a little bit more deeper, if you could tell us about the country's economic struggles and how they are impacting certain impoverished regions of the country.
The lifting of subsidies is a condition that the International Monetary Fund is imposing on Tunisia in exchange for further loans. The problem is these subsidies punish the poorest in society. They punish, and when I say the poorest in society, I mean possibly more than 50% of the Tunisian population. So in other words, we're talking fuel subsidies and the like. And the reality is that the transport system in Tunisia is so backwards and so incompetent that the reality is that everybody still is heavily dependent on cars. They are heavily dependent on being able to move around with their vehicles or with the vehicles of their relatives or the like. So when you remove the subsidies, now you've made that so much harder. You've increased the hole in the pockets of ordinary Tunisians. But it's important to stress that these are conditions being imposed by the IMF. These are conditions that are being pushed for by the International Monetary Fund, and the government, which is essentially cash-strapped, which is on the verge of bankruptcy, has really had little choice but to go along with the IMF conditions. But the problem is not the problem with the economy is not that the Tunisian government doesn't have money. The problem is in how it deploys its money, in the lethargic bureaucracy and bloated bureaucracy, in the manner in which there are so much paperwork needed for the most basic of things, the manner in which corruption is still rife and bribery is needed in order to get anything done. The people are not necessarily frustrated by the lack of economic development in and of itself, but rather the fact that in light of the lack of economic development and in light of the poverty and in light of the economic deprivation, the government still imposes arbitrary bureaucratic processes and makes it exceptionally hard to achieve even the smallest things, such as trying to retrieve the title of land or trying to receive the deed of your house. So simple, basic things. In Tunisia, it's a country in which to get one thing done, to extract one paper, you are required to travel miles and hundreds of kilometers to the capital. You can't get it from a regional province in the manner you would do in Canada or the US or the UK. Everything is centralized in Tunis. So there is this exacerbation of the regionalism in which you have the coastal areas which are well developed and you have the inner regions which are heavily underdeveloped, and that in itself breeds this sense of dissatisfaction with the neglect that is taking place from the political elite and the absence of any credible solution. And the fact that you raised the hopes of the Tunisians in 2011 when the world told them that they were special because they did a Jasmine revolution, because they brought down a dictator, because now they can vote, because now they have democracy. The attitude in Tunisia today is we voted 2011, we voted 2014, we voted 2019, nothing changed. Is this what all the fuss was about? And this is why we see now that the former regime is rising in the polls. And this is why we see people welcoming this coup. We have to stress that people are welcoming this coup. A large section of society support the president's coup in Tunisia because they want to go back to this sort of stability and security, some sort of order, which is what the UAE and Saudi often spout, this idea of amnu aman, security and stability. The reality is that for a population that lived 60 years under dictatorship, and that was the benchmark for what constitutes a nation, the fact that now people want to go back to it shows just how much the democratic project is in danger and how much it has failed the aspirations of those Tunisians.
As we wrap up today, we also wanted to ask you about the potential outlook in terms of democracy in Tunisia, as you just discussed just now. And do you think that this coup will affect bilateral relationships, for example, with neighboring North African countries?
I think that with regards to the future of democracy in Tunisia, I think it's deeply under threat. I think the reason being is that democracy for the Tunisians was supposed to be a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. Tunisians didn't want to vote for voting's sake or to choose their rulers. They wanted to vote because they believed that by voting, they would end up with the prosperity that they see in the US or the UK or in Europe. They believed that that was part of what drove that development. But now there's this disillusionment in that voting doesn't bring that development or that prosperity that they were originally promised. And that has significant ramifications in terms of how we move forward. Because now, even if you do elections, even if you go back to a democratic elections, the reality is that many people will abstain. They will not go to vote. And we've seen a decline in people who are participating in the elections because they no longer believe that elections are what are going to bring about that change. And we saw in the last elections how money and distributing boxes of macaroni and tomato sauce is more effective at securing votes than offering any promises or any policy. And Qais Said himself, the president, when he was asked during the presidential election, what's your program, what's your policy? He said, I have no program and I have no policy. And that's the state that the Tunisian democracy is in its fledgling case. In terms of its influence on bilateral ties, I think it's important to stress that the regional powers will breathe a sigh of relief that the Tunisian democratic project is under threat, because it means that they don't have to implement it in their own countries. Macron now will be able to, in France will be able to assert its dominance once more after it was threatened by the popular uprising, after it was threatened by the idea of an independent Tunisia. Algeria will be happy to see the Islamists out. Saudi Arabia will be happy to see the Islamists out. The UAE will believe that it has succeeded in destroying the Arab Spring after it helped the military coup in Egypt, after it helped plunge Libya into civil war, after it helped to plunge Yemen into civil war, and now it's on the verge of dividing Yemen between north and south. The UAE will be celebrating. They will be happy. They will believe that they are now well and truly the most powerful force in the last 50 years in the Middle East, by virtue of their extensive lobbying networks in Washington that have been improved by normalization of ties with Israel at the expense of the Palestinian people. The reality is that in terms of the crude nature of bilateral ties, Qais Said will find significant international support for his coup, and the only prospective defenders of the democracy in Tunisia will be the people who themselves are not entirely sure that it's worth defending.
A valuable conversation today with Sami Hamdi, who is a managing director of the International Interest, which is a global risk and intelligence company. Sami, once again, thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Back to the new studio.
Thank you, Saleha and Mr. Hamdi, for that analysis. Before moving on to our next segment, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. We recently shared the news about US President Joe Biden rejecting the idea of eliminating the filibuster. To discuss this in detail, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid in our Chicago studios. He's with Professor Gregory Koger. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hina. President Biden says that ditching filibuster is going to be chaotic for the Congress. It will lead to gridlock. And many people are thinking actually filibuster need to be eliminated to liberate people from the gridlock. What is true? What needs to be done? We have someone who is an expert, who has written a book on this topic, Professor Gregory Koger.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor Koger is the chair of political science at the University of Miami, an author of Filibustering, Political History of Obstruction in the House and the Senate. So was used to be in the House also, or it is just a Senate phenomena?
That's right. There used to be filibustering in the United States House of Representatives. I mean, the way I define filibustering is that it can happen in any legislative setting. So we also see filibusters in Japan, in South Korea, in the United Nations, historically. So yes, in the United States House, there's filibustering for about the first century of its history until the House enacted a set of rules which finally clamped down on the ability of the minority to slow down the legislative process. And so now in the United States Congress, only the Senate really allows a minority to stop the business of the chamber.
Do you agree with President Biden that throwing filibuster away will throw Congress in chaos and gridlock?
So what I understand him saying is that, as a former senator, he understands that the chamber runs on cooperation, just in the daily scheduling of what will come up and how they're going to debate major legislation when it comes to the floor. And what the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, has threatened is that if there is a major change to the legislative filibuster, all that cooperation will disappear. And there'll be just, from the perspective of senators, the way that they've been running the chamber will be thrown into chaos and they won't know what to do. I think the counterpoint is that right now there is in practice very little cooperation on practical matters, on passing legislation. And so for an American citizen, the difference between a chamber that does nothing with some measure of efficiency and that does nothing because there's chaos is unnoticeable. So they have nothing to lose.
Which was historically the generous majority which awarded filibuster to a minority?
No majority ever said, hey, we should create a right to filibuster. What happens in all of these settings, including the US Senate, is that members begin to assert rights that they have just built into the deliberative process, the right to speak, the right to offer motions, the right to not show up for work. If a majority doesn't crack down on that behavior, doesn't define the limits of the legitimate uses of speaking or not showing up for work or making motions, those can then be used as a way of slowing down the process. So it's not that someone one day said we should create a right to filibuster. It's that the right to filibuster was gradually asserted and no majority stopped people from asserting that right.
So how a minority is essentially a minority veto, isn't it?
That's the way it works now. So in my research, what I show is that it used to require work to filibuster. If you wanted to filibuster, you had to exert a great deal of effort to come to the floor of the Senate chamber, speak for long periods of time, read documents out loud, make motions. And in that effort was also a great deal of political risk because Americans considered that behavior to be unusual. Everyone understood that what those senators were doing was unfair. It was manipulating the rules of the process to achieve a result that was inconsistent with what the majority wanted. And Americans understood that to be improper unless it was done for a very rare and important cause. Well, all that's changed. And so there is no effort required for a senator to say, I don't want that bill to pass without my consent. And then that assertion is never challenged. And so the other way that the Senate can address this filibuster is to use what's known as a cloture rule, which requires a 60% majority to shut down debate on a piece of legislation. So what used to require effort now is simply a single senator demanding that the rest of the chamber produce a supermajority of 60 senators in order to move forward on a piece of legislation.
Would you define that as a privilege or an abuse?
It's certainly a privilege, right? Because another thing that my research has highlighted is that and a majority can take this away at any time it wants. And indeed, that senators should think of the rules of the chamber as not something that has intrinsic value. It's not, written down in a holy text somewhere. They're means to the end of producing legislation. In the past, there have been times when filibusters have helped to ensure a full debate of a piece of legislation. They've helped to ensure moderation of something that, a piece of legislation that perhaps was poorly drafted and would have gone too far. But in the modern Senate, we don't see those historical benefits of filibustering because just nothing happens. One way to back up the notion that nothing happens is that the House of Representatives has actually passed a wide array of legislation and sent it over to the Senate on issues from gun control to equal pay for women to a $15 minimum wage. And all those bills are just sitting there doing nothing because it'll be impossible to get 60 votes to vote for a single version of that bill, or because they just don't have time to go through the laborious negotiation process that is required to get 10 Republicans to support 50 Democrats on any one of these pieces of legislation. So we get nothing because it's hard for anybody to make the system work.
So hard work is needed to compromise, I guess. Compromise is a good word or a dirty word?
Compromise is great. So one of these senators, Democratic senators, who's skeptical of filibuster reform is Kristen Sinema of Arizona, and she defended her position in a Washington Post editorial, saying that this country works best when we have a bipartisan compromise on major issues. A negative example of this is when the Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act in 2010, and Republicans have spent the next 11 years trying to undermine it or have it get the Supreme Court to overturn it. And ideally, we would have had the minority party at the time, the Republicans, buy into that major legislation so that we all just understood that it would be the law of the land. And I believe that argument is sound as far as it goes. Given a choice between doing something in a partisan manner and doing something in a bipartisan manner, doing something in a bipartisan manner offers extra stability, even if it means the majority party gets less of what it wants at the beginning. The problem is that we are now given a choice between partisan and bipartisan could be better, but we don't get either of those things right now. What we are getting is no change. We get a majority party that is proposing legislation and a minority party that on most of these issues has simply decided either that it's not in their collective political interest to see the majority party succeed in passing legislation, or even if they're not trying to stop the majority party from developing a record of success, there aren't enough individual Republican senators who see it in their individual political interest to compromise on these issues. Like there probably aren't 10 Republicans who see it in their interest to compromise with the Democrats on gun control, even if the underlying proposal is very popular in opinion polls. It's bad politics for them.
Tell me, you being a political scientist and a historian of filibuster, are there some good example in which filibuster has helped our politics and governance? Are there some real bad examples of that?
The broad answer is yes. There are examples on all sides of the ledger. Let me just give one from personal experience. Like before I went to graduate school, I worked as a staffer on the U.S. House of Representatives. So I worked for an individual member of Congress. And one of the first pieces of legislation to come up was this broad-based bill that said that if the government imposes any sort of rule which diminishes the value of someone's real estate property, then the government has to pay them money automatically. And that there's an argument for that the government can't just take your property and so forth. But the way the bill was written was so broad and vague that it would have created just a massive entitlement system for people who own property. And when that bill got to the Senate, the Democrats, then in the minority, were in a position to say, that seems like it's a poorly written piece of legislation, and you guys just haven't thought that through. And that was what my own boss, a Republican, said at the time was, we don't have to think about this. We'll send it over to the Senate, and they'll figure it out. So the House Republicans were in a position to take the popular position on a piece of legislation that they really hadn't thought about. And then it went over to the Senate, and then the senators were in a position where the minority party could keep the majority party from just passing bad legislation without thinking about it, and to force them to sit down and negotiate and really think through what kind of legislation they want to pass on that issue. That's one example that comes to mind because I lived it, because I saw a member of the U.S. House saying, yeah, I don't even care if this is bad legislation. I'll let the senators figure it out. Both because in the Senate, the minority party has the ability to say no, but also because what the minority party can do is force the majority party to fully debate legislation. I mean, historically, just another example from the 1990s, both parties understood that the campaign finance system they had was open to corruption because people were making large donations to political parties with the expectation that those parties would follow through on certain policies. And yet it took the Democrats to sort of force the majority party, the Republicans, to vote on legislation to change the campaign finance system. And so the Democrats in the Senate, because they were able to filibuster, were able to say, like, you have your priorities, and we are going to filibuster it until you vote on our priority, which is campaign finance reform. And so on multiple occasions, they forced these votes, they drew attention to the issue, and they forced individual Senate Republicans to, think about what position they wanted to have on campaign finance reform. And that eventually led to a Republican Senate in 2001, 2002, approving campaign finance reform because they just realized that something needed to be done and that they could no longer defend the existing system. So the use of the filibuster to force issues on the agenda, to have open debates on major policy issues, helped us come to a better campaign finance system in 2002.
What are, Professor Koger, reforms which you recommend to the Senate in the filibuster system the way it is?
I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about the filibuster and how they want to reform it, they just think we should have rules like the House has, where a majority can do whatever it wants. And as a longtime student of Congress, I've seen the downside of that. The majority party can't propose legislation that is just poorly written, not thought through, and maybe they're doing it just to satisfy like one of their constituency groups. Fine. So I'm a little nervous about simple majority rule, particularly in the Senate, where they would need to rethink every aspect of how they do business in order to convert from this system that runs on mutual cooperation to a system that runs on majority rule. So what I think would be effective in the short run, at least, is to just make filibustering costly again, make senators expend some effort and pay a political price for filibustering. And the simplest way to do that, I think, would be to, it sounds small, but to reverse the burden of attendance on a cloture vote. So right now, in order to limit debate on an issue, 60 people have to show up in the Senate and vote, yes, I want to limit debate on this issue. And what I'm proposing is to just reverse that and say, in order to keep debate going on a piece of legislation, 41 senators have to show up and vote no. It's the same percentage margin, but the attendance burden is reversed. Seems small. It's meaningless if everyone shows up to vote. But if you reverse that burden, then what the majority party can do is schedule cloture votes all day and all night and all weekend, so that senators who want to do nothing, they have to give up their nights and their weekends to make sure that the Senate does nothing. And if they can't find 41 people who are that committed to doing nothing on a particular issue, well, then debate will be limited, and the Senate can move forward and make progress. But by forcing senators to pay a price, personal and political, for what they're doing, I think would move the chamber forward and incentivize the minority party to compromise on legislation where right now they pay no price for saying no.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Coker, for your time. I really appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Back to you, Hannah.
Thank you so much. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.